Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by Inner City Press, and what unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was a full-scale implosion of a carefully constructed empire, dismantled not by prosecutors, not by federal agents, but by the very man who was supposed to defend it. What caused Sean Diddy Combs, one of the most powerful figures in entertainment, to physically collapse in the middle of his own trial? What testimony could possibly leave one of the music industry's most calculating and composed moguls gasping for air and crumpling onto the cold, unforgiving floor of a federal courtroom as medics rushed to his aid? The answer shocked everyone present and sent ripples through the entire entertainment world, a stunning betrayal by his own lead defense attorney, Marcus Williams, the man Diddy had trusted most in that room, the legal mind who had stood by his side for months, crafting intricate defense strategies, challenging every motion from the prosecution, publicly vowing to dismantle the case against his client, but who in a single, unprecedented move became Diddy's most devastating adversary. With nothing more than the press of a button. Gasps echoed through the packed gallery as Williams, once a beacon of loyalty and protection for the embattled mogul, calmly placed a small, gleaming silver flash drive into the court clerk's hand and announced, in a steady voice that betrayed none of the inner turmoil that must have been eating at him, that he could no longer continue representing Mr. Combs in good conscience. It was an announcement that landed like an earthquake, silencing the room as the weight of what was unfolding registered on every face, the reporters clutching their pens mid-scribble, the legal analysts exchanging knowing yet stunned glances. The judge momentarily frozen before regaining composure, and Diddy himself, jaw clenched but eyes suddenly darting with alarm between Williams and the flash drive, as though watching the last unbreached wall of his empire being reduced to rubble. What Marcus Williams revealed next wasn't just damaging, it was catastrophic. He informed the court that the flash drive contained recordings of private conversations between himself and Diddy, recordings that under normal circumstances would be protected by the ironclad shield of attorney-client privilege, the very bedrock of the legal defense system. But Williams explained, with a mix of resolve and quiet despair, that these recordings fell under the crime-fraud exception, meaning they captured his client not merely discussing his defense but allegedly admitting to criminal acts, coordinating efforts to obstruct justice, and making statements that, in Williams's professional and ethical judgment, could not remain hidden without implicating himself as an accessory. And then, before anyone could process the enormity of what was happening, the courtroom speakers crackled to life, not with a prosecutor's exhibit, not with an FBI wiretap, but with Diddy's own unmistakable voice filling the silent room. His tone casual, confident, chilling, "Make it go away, Marcus. That's what I pay you for. These girls know what they signed up for." In that moment, time seemed to stop. Even the judge, known for his unshakable demeanor in the face of sensational cases, sat back in his chair, his face briefly betraying the shock shared by everyone present. Until that moment, Diddy had maintained his carefully rehearsed facade, head high, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward with the unwavering confidence of a man who had weathered decades of scandal and controversy, but as his own words played back to him, the cracks began to show. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, whispered frantically to his remaining counsel, and stared daggers at Marcus Williams, as if willing his now former attorney to spontaneously combust under the weight of his glare. But whatever hope Diddy had of containing this implosion evaporated as Williams stood tall, his voice growing steadier with every sentence, recounting how he had been brought into Diddy's circle 3 years ago at a charity gala, lured not by celebrity or spectacle, but by the promise of high-stakes legal work that, at least at first, appeared to be ethically straightforward. Williams spoke of how Diddy approached him that night, champagne in hand, exuding the effortless charm of a man used to bending others to his will, and said, "I need someone who thinks ahead of problems, not just reacts to them, before slipping his business card into the attorney's jacket pocket like a man planting the seed of an inevitable alliance." 2 weeks later, Marcus Williams had become more than just a consultant. He was Diddy's go-to legal advisor, handling everything from contract negotiations to crisis management, the kind of lawyer who didn't just fight fires but prevented them from starting. It was a role Williams excelled in, a role that played to his strengths as one of New York's most formidable defense attorneys, known for his meticulous preparation and unwavering ethical standards. But as the federal investigation into Diddy's empire gained momentum, that role began to morph into something darker, something that gnawed at the very core of Williams's identity as a lawyer sworn to uphold the law even while defending those accused of breaking it. He described the late-night phone calls that first set off alarm bells, the slurred yet calculated voice of Diddy instructing him to reach out to Kimberly, a potential witness, and remind her about our agreement, words that at the time seemed like routine legal maneuvering over a non-disclosure agreement, but that, in hindsight, carried the unmistakable stench of witness intimidation. He recounted Kimberly's fearful reaction during their meeting, how she hadn't seemed like a woman worried about breaching a contract but like someone terrified for her safety, her eyes darting nervously around the upscale Manhattan cafe where they met, her hands trembling as she stirred her untouched coffee. And Williams confessed how that encounter planted a seed of doubt that grew with every interaction, every coded conversation on one of Diddy's multiple burner phones, every face-to-face meeting conducted with music blaring in the background, a tactic prosecutors would later confirm was meant to thwart potential surveillance. Williams explained how, initially for his own protection, he began recording these conversations, invoking New York's one-party consent laws as his shield, but as the hours of audio accumulated, so did his dread. What he captured wasn't just a client venting or strategizing, it was a man casually, almost gleefully, admitting to acts that could unravel not just his defense but his entire empire. Williams spoke of listening back to those recordings alone in his office late at night, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across his weary face as he heard Diddy laugh about having enough to destroy them 10 times over when referring to potential witnesses, his voice dropping to a sinister murmur when he discussed making life impossible for those who considered cooperating with the feds. The breaking point, Williams told the court, came just the day before this dramatic revelation, when he recorded Diddy calmly explaining how he intended to use his vast resources to ensure a key witness reconsidered her statement or faced consequences, his tone chillingly pragmatic as he said, "I'm not talking about hurting anybody, Marcus. Just making it impossible for her to live normally. Everyone has skeletons. Everyone has something to lose." Williams paused as he recounted that moment, his voice thick with the weight of the ethical crisis that had consumed him since pressing the record button on that conversation. He described staring at the recorder for what felt like hours, grappling with the reality that every second he remained silent made him complicit in a machinery of intimidation and suppression that extended far beyond the courtroom. And so, he said, he made the hardest decision of his professional life, to copy those files onto a flash drive, call his own attorney, and prepare to detonate the very defense he had built. Williams described how that night became a turning point, the kind that forever divides a life into before and after. He didn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but the words that had spilled so casually from Diddy's mouth, words that painted a picture of a man who saw people not as individuals with dignity but as pawns in an endless game of power and preservation. He told the jury that his hands shook as he prepared the flash drive, not out of fear of Diddy, though he admitted there was plenty to fear, but out of fear for what this act of betrayal would mean for him as a lawyer, a father, and a man who had spent his entire career walking the razor's edge between zealously defending his clients and compromising his integrity. He spoke of calling his wife in the middle of the night, his voice barely above a whisper as he told her, "I don't know who I am if I keep this secret," and how she responded with the kind of quiet strength that only those who have seen the cost of silence can muster, then don't keep it. When court reconvened, the recordings were played in their entirety, each one more damning than the last, and with every word, the gallery could feel the oxygen being sucked out of the room. There was Diddy mocking the women who had come forward, dismissing their pain as regret with a price tag. There was Diddy discussing loyalty tests at his infamous parties, where guests were forced to surrender their phones and, in some cases, their dignity, under the guise of exclusivity and privacy. There was Diddy casually referring to a fixer tasked with ensuring that certain witnesses remembered what happens when you cross me, his voice dripping with a cold confidence that made it clear this wasn't a man bluffing, this was a man who believed himself untouchable. And then came the recording that would haunt everyone in that room, Diddy, speaking in a low, almost conspiratorial tone, instructing Marcus Williams to remind Jasmine about Turks and Caicos 2019, a reference that the prosecution would later explained corresponded to a trip where the witness had allegedly been secretly recorded in a compromising situation, footage Diddy intended to use as leverage if she cooperated with federal investigators. "That sounds like blackmail," Williams could be heard responding on the tape, his voice strained with disbelief and disgust. Diddy's response? A chilling laugh, followed by, "That's such an ugly word, counselor. I prefer leverage. Everybody signed up for what they did. I just kept receipts." The words landed like a hammer blow, erasing any doubt about the intent behind his actions and shattering whatever illusion remained that these were simply aggressive but legal defense tactics. As the final recording ended, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Reporters who had covered high-profile trials for decades stared wide-eyed at one another, their pens suspended midair. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away from Diddy, others staring at him with open contempt. Even the judge, who had maintained an air of stoic impartiality throughout the trial, allowed himself a brief, visible exhale. The weight of what he had just heard pressing down on the room like a physical force. And then the unthinkable happened. Diddy, who had been visibly unraveling throughout the playback, his jaw clenched, his breathing shallow, his fingers drumming nervously against the defense table, suddenly lurched to his feet, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and betrayal. "You backstabbing," he began, his voice a raw growl, but before he could finish the sentence, his eyes widened, his hand flew to his chest, and with a sickening thud that reverberated through the hushed room, Sean Diddy Combs collapsed to the floor. Gasps erupted from the gallery as his remaining attorney and members of his security team rushed to his side. Medics, who had been on standby for the high-stakes trial, sprinted into the room, kneeling beside the fallen mogul as they worked frantically to stabilize him. His body trembled, his skin pale and clammy, his breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps as oxygen was administered. For several agonizing minutes, the courtroom was transformed from a theater of justice into a battlefield for survival, the usual rhythm of legal proceedings replaced by the urgent commands of medical professionals fighting to keep a man alive. When the judge finally called for a recess, ordering everyone except essential personnel to clear the courtroom, Diddy lay motionless, his once imposing frame reduced to a fragile shell of the power and bravado that had defined him for decades. When proceedings resumed nearly an hour later, Diddy was gone, transported to a hospital for what his representatives would later describe as stress-induced medical complications, but Marcus Williams remained, his posture straight, his voice steady, his resolve unbroken. He told the jury that what they had just heard wasn't an aberration, wasn't a few ill-chosen words taken out of context, but part of a systematic pattern of control, intimidation, and manipulation that had allowed his client to operate above the law for years. Mr. Combs maintained his public image through philanthropy, through business success, through the carefully curated persona of a man who built an empire from nothing, Williams said, his voice growing more impassioned with each word, but behind that facade, he created an environment of fear, of silence, of mutually assured destruction for anyone who dared to challenge him. He explained how Diddy compartmentalized his operations, ensuring that no one, not his attorneys, not his accountants, not his assistants, had the full picture. "We all held pieces of the puzzle," Williams said, but only Mr. Combs saw the complete picture. That was by design. It made him untouchable. Until now. He admitted, with visible shame, how he had allowed himself to become a cog in that machine, rationalizing his silence as the cost of doing his job, convincing himself that he could remain ethically intact while representing a client who demanded not just legal defense, but moral complicity. But then, Williams said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I realized that if I didn't speak now, my silence would become my legacy. And I couldn't live with that." He looked directly at the jury, his gaze unwavering. "My children are going to learn about this case in law school someday. I had to be on the right side of it." The air in the courtroom was suffocating when the jury reassembled, each member visibly grappling with the seismic weight of what they had just witnessed, not just the recordings, not just the betrayal of attorney-client privilege, but the collapse of a man who once seemed untouchable. Even the prosecution, who had prepared for every possible twist in this trial, seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer drama of it all. But Marcus Williams wasn't done, not by a long shot. As he resumed his testimony, his tone shifted from The clinical precision of a legal professional presenting evidence to the raw candor of a man unburdening himself after months of moral imprisonment. When I first agreed to represent Mr. Combs, Williams said, his voice steady but tinged with regret, I believed I was defending a man unjustly targeted by a system that often seeks to destroy successful black entrepreneurs. That's what he told me. That's what I told myself. But what I uncovered over these past months was not the story of a man persecuted by an unfair system. It was the story of a man who mastered that system, twisted it, to protect himself at all costs. He leaned forward, looking at the jury, his words slow and deliberate. Those recordings weren't outbursts. They weren't slips of the tongue. They were strategy sessions. Cold, calculated, deliberate. This wasn't a man acting out of fear or desperation. This was a man confident in his ability to bend people, witnesses, employees, even his own legal team, to his will. Williams then requested permission to play one final clip, a recording he had hesitated to include because, in his words, it revealed not just Mr. Combs' intentions but his blueprint for how he maintained power for decades. The judge granted the request. The speakers crackled to life, filling the room with Diddy's voice once again, calm, measured, almost eerily detached. You know what the problem with people is, Marcus? They think morality matters. It doesn't. Fear matters. Options matter. You make sure they don't have any, and you can make anyone dance to your tune. That's how you stay on top. You collect everything, conversations, videos, secrets. You don't use it unless you have to. But when you do, they fold every single time. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. One juror covered her mouth with her hand. Another shook his head in disbelief. Even seasoned reporters, men and women who had heard every kind of damning testimony imaginable, looked shaken, as though they had been given an unfiltered glimpse into the dark, beating heart of absolute power. Williams let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. This is what I was part of. This is what I was asked to defend. This is why I couldn't stay silent. His eyes flicked briefly toward Diddy's empty chair, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that the man who had once seemed larger than life was now lying in a hospital bed, his empire crumbling around him. The prosecution seized the moment, rising to cross-examine Williams. Mr. Williams, the lead prosecutor began, her tone measured but sharp, you've described a pattern of control and intimidation. In your professional opinion, were these actions consistent with legitimate legal defense strategies? Williams didn't hesitate. No. They weren't strategies to defend against false accusations. They were mechanisms to suppress the truth. There's a difference between defending a client and enabling their abuse of power. I crossed that line. And I refuse to cross it again. The prosecutor nodded, then pressed further. Did Mr. Combs ever express concern about the morality of his actions? Did he ever show remorse? Williams' face hardened. No. In fact, he often framed his actions as necessary, even virtuous. He called it protecting his legacy. He told me more than once, you don't build an empire by playing fair. You build it by making sure no one dares challenge you. With each answer, the portrait of Diddy that emerged was not that of a misunderstood mogul, but of a man who had constructed an intricate web of fear, influence, and leverage, a web now unraveling in real time. Outside the courthouse, the impact of Williams' testimony was immediate and explosive. News outlets broke from their regular programming to broadcast live updates. Social media erupted with hashtags like #DiddyTrial and #TheReceipts, as excerpts from the recordings circulated at lightning speed. Former associates of Combs began issuing statements, some distancing themselves, others hinting at their own experiences of intimidation. Industry insiders whispered about it, a panic chain reaction, as executives, artists, and even political figures quietly reviewed their past dealings with the mogul, wondering how many of their secrets were buried in his infamous receipts. Behind closed doors, record labels held emergency meetings. Brands with lucrative partnerships scrambled to cut ties. Attorneys representing other potential witnesses began contacting the prosecution, suddenly eager to cooperate. What had started as a trial about one man's alleged crimes was transforming into a reckoning for an entire industry, a reckoning built on the testimony of one lawyer who decided that his conscience was worth more than his client's checkbook. Williams ended his testimony with a statement that felt less like a legal observation and more like a challenge to everyone listening. You can tell a lot about a man by what he fears most. Mr. Combs doesn't fear prison. He doesn't fear losing his wealth. He fears losing control over his narrative, over his people, over his empire. And today, for the first time in decades, that control is slipping. The courtroom was silent as Williams stepped down from the stand, his head held high, his silver flash drive now part of the official record, a tiny device containing the words that had brought a giant to his knees. The next morning, the courthouse was unrecognizable. Barricades kept an overflowing sea of press at bay, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as black SUVs pulled up one by one. Satellite trucks lined the block. Reporters went live every 15 minutes, breathlessly narrating the collapse of one of the most powerful men in music. Inside, the tension was so thick it clung to the skin. Marcus Williams' bombshell testimony hadn't just cracked the dam, it had obliterated it. And now, a flood of consequences was rushing toward everyone who had ever been part of Diddy's empire. When the court reconvened, Diddy was wheeled in, his complexion pale, a thin oxygen tube still clipped beneath his nose. Gone was the unshakable mogul who swaggered into the first day of trial in designer suits and diamond-encrusted cufflinks. In his place was a man whose carefully manufactured armor had been stripped away. He avoided eye contact with the jury, with the press, even with his own remaining attorney. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was rotting from the inside out. Judge Whitaker entered, her face set in an expression that betrayed no emotion but carried the weight of the moment. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented yesterday," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. "In light of Mr. Williams' testimony and the recordings entered into evidence, the court will allow the prosecution to pursue additional charges of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." The words hit like a gavel to the chest. Gasps filled the room. Diddy's attorney tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "This court will not tolerate gamesmanship. The evidence speaks for itself. We proceed." The prosecution wasted no time. Lead prosecutor Amanda Reyes rose from her chair, her notes meticulously organized, her voice sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, the government also intends to call new witnesses whose testimonies corroborate the patterns Mr. Williams described." She turned, scanning the room, and then dropped the bombshell. "Several of these witnesses are former employees of Mr. Combs. Some are individuals who previously signed non-disclosure agreements. They are here today because Mr. Williams' testimony gave them the courage to come forward." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Diddy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand clutching the armrest with white-knuckled tension. The first to take the stand was Erica Sloan, a former event planner who worked for Combs Enterprises for nearly a decade. Her tailored suit and steady posture couldn't mask the tremor in her voice as she recounted what she described as a culture of intimidation so pervasive it seeped into every corner of that organization. "I planned his private parties, his corporate events, his charity galas," Sloan testified. "And I watched the same playbook unfold every time. Phones collected at the door. Security briefings before events. Special instructions for VIP handling. It was all about control, controlling the environment, controlling the guests, controlling the narrative." Reyes approached, her voice gentler now. "Ms. Sloan, did you witness anything that supports Mr. Williams' testimony regarding the use of leverage against potential witnesses?" Erica hesitated, her gaze shifting toward Diddy before settling on the jury. "Yes. I did. I saw the lists, color-coded lists that told us who needed to be managed. I overheard calls where he talked about ruining people if they crossed him. And I knew what happened to staff who asked too many questions." Her voice broke slightly. "They disappeared. One day they'd be running an event, the next their security badges wouldn't work, Their emails were wiped, and no one dared ask where they'd gone. As Sloane's words echoed through the courtroom, Diddy's remaining attorney objected. "Speculation, Your Honor." But the judge waved it off. "The witness is recounting her direct experience." Overruled. Then came the second witness, a name that made the press gallery collectively lean forward. Justin Cole, a former Combs Enterprises security consultant, tall and broad-shouldered with the quiet demeanor of someone used to being invisible in high-powered rooms, Cole spoke with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment for months. "I was hired to keep Mr. Combs safe," he said. "But I ended up keeping his secrets. There were surveillance rooms in multiple properties, dedicated spaces where feeds from hidden cameras were monitored. I was told it was for security. But I knew better. Some of the footage I saw, it wasn't about protection. It was about leverage." He called them insurance policies. The jury scribbled notes furiously. Several members looked visibly unsettled. Cole continued, "I once asked a supervisor why we needed cameras in certain areas. He told me, Mr. Combs doesn't just protect himself from threats, he makes sure nobody ever becomes one." Then came the moment that drove the point home. Cole confirmed that he had personally transported hard drives containing sensitive material between Diddy's properties, drives he now believed were used to maintain control over celebrities, employees, and associates. "It wasn't security," he said flatly. "It was a weapon." The judge ordered the drives subpoenaed. The prosecution smiled grimly. By mid-afternoon, the trial had become something more than a legal proceeding. It was a public autopsy of an empire, a dissection of how power could be hoarded, weaponized, and abused under the guise of business as usual. Outside the courthouse, the world was reeling. Former collaborators scrubbed Diddy's name from their social media. Sponsorship deals were quietly dissolved. Major networks debated whether to pull programming connected to him. And in a twist no one saw coming, two high-profile figures, artists once thought to be his closest allies, issued statements saying they were in discussions with federal authorities. Inside, the judge called for an adjournment, but the echoes of the day's testimonies lingered. Diddy sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his empire collapsing one witness at a time. For the jury, the story was no longer about individual allegations. It was about a machine, one designed to protect its creator at all costs, now being dismantled piece by piece in a federal courtroom. And for the world watching, one question grew louder by the day: how many more people would find the courage to step forward now that the silence had been broken?